Welcome to the Must Reads interview series sponsored by the Perkins Center for Preaching Excellence. I'm Wes Allen. I'm excited to have with me today a returning guest, Tom Long, one of the leading voices in homiletics. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Well, the book we're going to be talking about today is your Proclaiming the Parables, Preaching and Teaching the Kingdom of God. Um, in one of your early books, Preaching in the Literary Forms of the Bible, you had a chapter on parables. If I remember correctly, in a sermon recorded for the Great Preacher series a good while back, you preached on a parable. It seems parables have been a pretty important part of your career across the years. So, what is it about parables that led you to want to write this book in retirement?
I got interested in the parables deeply when I was a graduate student, and I would go to the meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature. And in those days, there was a seminar, the Parable Seminar. It involved about 15 of the great parable scholars from around the world gathered around a table arguing with each other about interpretation, and 200 of us fishbowling and watching them. And these men and women, these scholars, were cutting a new path in biblical hermeneutics, and the wind just ruffled in my hair. And so I raced home after 2 or 3 of those sessions and developed a course on preaching the parables, and I taught it almost every year of the 40 years that I taught preaching. So I had an ongoing excitement about the power of parables.
All right, so for all these years, you've been teaching on this and you finally put it down into writing in this book. So, the obvious question is, how has your understanding of parables changed since those early years of attending those seminars at the SBL to what you wrote in the book?
The last year that I taught the course Preaching the Parables, I was a visiting scholar at Yale. I had just retired. And I always began that course with a lecture on the power of parables. And on the way back to my apartment after giving that lecture, it suddenly dawned on me, these are wonderful students and they're going to preach great sermons in the course, and they did. But they're not going to be any more powerful than any other sermon that they preach. And the sermons I've preached on parables, they're just like sermons on the Psalms or healing stories. If I'm arguing that the parables are so powerful, where does the power go when we preach on them? And I fretted about that for a couple of weeks and finally snapped up at 2 o'clock in the morning one night and had an insight about what it was that I had been, like most people who study parables, arguing that the power in parables is in their literary form. And there is great power in their literary form. They're poetic language and have the spring action. But the real power in parables is in their referent. They are all explicitly or implicitly about the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, which I take to be the event of God breaking into human life. And suddenly the parables dawned on me they're sort of like GPS devices that take us to those places where the life of God is breaking into our life, which would be otherwise hidden. But the parables take you and say, this is what it's like. The kingdom of God is like this.
So a shift from literary reading to theological reading, that emphasis on the kingdom. Um,
Yeah, I had to, if I could just add one thing.
no, yeah, sure.
I found myself engaged by the work of the theologian Christopher Morse at Union Seminary in New York, who argues, as all of us do, that the image of heaven in the New Testament is not mainly someplace we go when we die. Heaven is an image for where God advents toward us. God speaks from heaven, acts from heaven. And he ends his little book on this with a great phrase. He said, the task of a disciple is to be on hand for that which is at hand, but not in hand. That is the breaking in of the life of God. And so the parables, to me now, their power is they let us be on hand for that which is at hand, but not in hand.
And I do think it's hard for preachers to look at the world with all that's going on and say, there's God breaking in, there's God breaking in. And it's so important. And the parables do sort of break the lens for the way we usually do that. Now, in the book, you you don't only give this overview, which that your introduction's great to parables in general, but you go through every single parable in the Synoptic Gospels, even versions that are repeated in more than one gospel, and you note the changes, those kind of things. So the question I want to end with, it might be like asking a parent which child is their favorite. But is there a parable that sort of continually surprises you in terms of how it names where God is breaking in, or maybe in ways you think others underestimate?
Yeah. Uh, it's hard to pick a favorite parable, but one that I warmed up to considerably and then finally fell in love with is the odd parable of the unjust steward in Luke. And this is the one that's so hard to interpret because it's got a scoundrel, a guy who's embezzling from his employer. He gets caught and he's going to be thrown out of his job, and he doesn't know what to do. And finally he decides, oh, I know what I'll do. And he goes and cuts deals with all the creditors of his boss so that when he's kicked out of his job, they'll be indebted to him and will take him into their homes. So you think, well, what are we going to do with that? And what Jesus says at the end of that is, I wish my disciples were as shrewd as that guy. In other words, if people would get up for justice and love every morning and be as industrious and zealous as Jack Welch was at GE, the kingdom would be lived out in much more dramatic ways. And then he says, make friends for yourselves with unrighteous mammon, so that when it fails, they may receive you into their eternal habitation. What in the world? Is he talking about drug money or casino profits, or what are the unrighteous mammon? Well, in Luke, unrighteous mammon is really the money of the unrighteous age. In other words, it's money. And in Luke, an understanding, the Jesus of Luke understands the money that we have in our bank accounts and purses and wallets to be like Confederate money in 1863. It's temporarily negotiable, but it's from a doomed sovereignty. And so it doesn't have much of a shelf life, but it does have a shelf life. So make kingdom friends with it. And we've already been told by Jesus who those are. They're the lame and the weak and the blind and the halt and the hungry and the needy. And then there's that great picture in Luke where the kingdom opens up and the great banquet's going on. And there they all are waiting for us to welcome us to the table with them.
Well, I hope everybody who watches this hears that and knows I've got to buy this book because it's worth having on every preacher's shelf. So go out there and get it. And Tom, you're going to come and actually online do a workshop for us on this coming in the fall of 2025. So thank you
That's
for
right.
that. And registration will be out for that before too long. So
Looking
thank you for
forward to
spending
that.
a little time with me, Tom.
Great to see you again, Wes.
Bye bye.